I'm a psychiatric nurse, and early in my career, I worked at a residential mental health facility. One of our residents was an elective mute, which means that he couldn't talk. But there were no medical reasons as to why. He had spoken earlier in his life, and in fact seemed quite normal back then, with the exception of being close to 7 feet tall. He'd been raised in the Deep South and joined the military when he was 19. But one night, he vanished. He was declared AWOL, and eventually he was declared missing and dead. 10 years later, a 7-foot-tall man walked into a VA hospital emergency room in my part of the Midwest and said to the receptionist, "My name is Marion Duchesne, not the real name, and I've been dead for 10 years. Those were the last words he ever spoke. He was covered with dust, and he was wearing the same clothes he'd been reported to be wearing the night he vanished. His social security number had not been used, and he had no identification on his person. However, they were able to identify him, I guess, via fingerprints. The family was notified, but they said they had already grieved their lost man, and that whomever was claiming to be him simply could not be. They demanded not to be contacted again. Marion paced all day, every day, moving his mouth that looked like talking or muttering, but no sound came out. He had an unnerving habit of throwing his head back with his mouth wide open as if he were laughing heartily, but not even a breath could be heard. If I talked to him, he appeared to listen, periodically throwing his head back in that laughter-mimicking way of his. Various medications were tried, but they did not affect him either positively or negatively. Occupational therapy did nothing, because Marion would just grin, and unless told to stay put, he'd get up and start pacing again. On my last day at that job, the last thing I saw was Marion, pacing in the parking lot, throwing his head back to laugh. Later I wondered if all along I'd been dealing with a ghost. All these years later, I still don't know. Years ago, a few friends and I went to hang out in a graveyard. Stupid thing to do for a bunch of bored 18-year-olds on a weekday night. But what happened next was very real to all of our experiences. We were driving my friend's really old beat-up Subaru through the massive graveyard. We stopped to get out and walk around. We walked down a hill and came across a little pond. There was someone sitting on a rock on the other side of the pond. The figure was all black, and we couldn't make out any features other than the fact it looked like a man who was wearing some old-style top hat. Stupid us waved and shouted, "Hi!" He didn't show any acknowledgement or wave back. The man sat on the rock, still. All of a sudden, he jumped to his feet, started running to us on the water, and then vanished in thin, about halfway on the pond. My friends and I screamed and ran back to her car. I didn't want to believe what we saw, but we all saw it happen. We got back to her car and tried to start it. It wouldn't start. Frantically trying to get it started, we all started panicking and getting very scared. That's when we heard some banging on the car from the back. It wasn't a constant bang, but every few seconds or so we'd hear it. Nobody was outside from what we could see in the dark, but something was making a noise on the car. At this point, I'm having a full-blown panic attack, screaming and crying to get us out. Luckily, my friends seemed a bit less panicky than I was and helped keep me calm. It was obvious that they were just as freaked out, however more speechless and pale-faced. We would have left the car in the graveyard and walked the long journey to the exit if it wasn't for the banging on the car. We didn't want to get out and leave. After about a minute, the banging stopped. I'll call my mom to come give us a boost, I thought. I'm not entirely sure why none of us thought to call sooner. However, I don't believe anyone thinks rationally while panicking. At this point, 15 minutes had gone by since we got back in her car. I opened my phone and started dialing and realized I had no service. None of us had any cell service. We bantered back and forth for a few more minutes, trying to figure out what to do, and decided against leaving the car because whatever was outside was not what we wanted to come face to face with. The next 30 minutes were spent trying to get her car started. No banging was heard afterwards, but we felt this heavy feeling around us, almost as if it created this pressure on our chest. It's quite difficult to explain, as I've never felt anything like it before. Finally, her car started, and she hit the pedal to the metal. We sped out of the graveyard so fast. Immediately crossing the gates, all of our phones regained cell service. I'll never be able to explain what caused any of this or why certain things happened. One thing I know for certain is that someone or something was out there, and it was not an animal or human. I worked as a forensic nurse in a hospital's lockup unit. We had one older lady who swore she was being haunted and abused by a demon she would call Tiberius. So many crazy things happened while she was on the unit. We'd go into the room, do normal care, leave, and seconds later, she'd start screaming bloody murder. We'd run into the room to find her looking like she'd been in a fight with a boxing champ. Bloody lip, black eye, markings all over her body. No one ever saw her doing this stuff to herself. Things would get moved around the room by themselves. At one point, she was in protective restraints because the doctor thought she was hurting herself. There was no way she could have moved or done anything to herself while in these restraints. But new marks would always appear, or her tray cart would be across the room. The room was secure, so there was no way someone else was doing this. When we asked her questions, she'd just say, "It was Tiberius." After she was discharged, we always had trouble with that room. If there was going to be a rapid response or code, it happened in that room. One night, a guard reported lights blinking on and off. It was that room